He confessed to murdering over 100 people. Confessed in diaries, in letters, in conversations with priests, in interviews with journalists, and eventually in a courtroom. But here's the strange thing. For years, nobody believed him. Investigators thought he was lying. They thought he was seeking attention. They thought he was mentally ill and delusional. But he wasn't lying. He was telling the truth, over and over and over again. The only problem was that nobody wanted to listen. This is the story of a serial killer who desperately wanted to be caught, who confessed repeatedly to his crimes, and who was largely ignored until it was far too late. Who was he? His name was Samuel Dalton, though he had used dozens of aliases throughout his life. He was born in 1958 in a small town in rural Oregon to a mother who was mentally ill and a father who was absent. Australia, his childhood was marked by poverty, neglect, and exposure to violence. His mother, Patricia, suffered from severe schizophrenia. She would have episodes where she believed that Samuel was sent by demons to harm her. She would lock him in the basement for days without food. She would beat him with whatever was nearby. She would tell him that he was evil, that he was born to hurt people, that he was a demon in human form. His father, George, was a truck driver who was rarely home. He was home, he was typically drunk and physically violent. He beat Patricia. He beat Samuel. The apartment where they lived was a constant war zone of screaming, violence, and chaos. Samuel learned early that the world was a dangerous and violent place, that people hurt each other, that love was just another form of control and violence. He was taken away from his parents when he was 7 years old by Child Protective Services after teachers noticed severe bruising and behavioral problems. He spent the next 11 years in foster care, cycling through 6 different foster homes. Some of his foster parents were well-meaning but overwhelmed. Others were abusive. In one home, he was sexually abused by his foster father for 2 years before another child in the home reported it. In another home, he was used as a slave laborer, forced to work in the fields from dawn to dusk, while his foster parents kept his social services stipend and gave him minimal food. By the time Samuel aged out of the foster care system at 18, he was deeply traumatized, deeply angry, and deeply broken. Samuel was intelligent, at a high IQ. He excelled academically in the foster homes where education was actually encouraged. But intelligence coupled with trauma and neglect can be a dangerous combination. Samuel had all the intellectual capability to understand right and wrong, but he had no emotional capacity for empathy. He had been shown by his own parents and by the systems that were supposed to protect him that violence was acceptable. Harming others was normal, that he was fundamentally unlovable and dangerous. He believed what his mother had told him, that he was a demon, that he was meant to hurt people, that he was evil. And rather than fighting against this identity, he embraced it. He decided that if the world had decided he was a monster, he would become a monster. At 18, Samuel was released from the foster care system with $50 and a bus ticket. He had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. He spent several months homeless, living on the streets. He was hungry and desperate and completely alone. And in the midst of that desperation, he committed his first murder, the first kill. The victim's name was Michael Chen. He was a college student who was walking home late at night after studying at the library. Samuel was hiding behind a building, hoping to steal from someone, hoping to get enough money to buy food. Michael noticed Samuel and, instead of walking past him, asked if he was okay. He offered to buy Samuel food. Michael was a kind person, the type of person who couldn't walk past someone suffering without trying to help. It was an act of compassion that cost him his life. Samuel was initially going to rob Michael. But as they talked, as Michael showed him kindness and concern, something happened in Samuel. He felt an unfamiliar emotion, gratitude. For a moment, Samuel felt seen and valued by another human being. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. And then, immediately after that feeling, he felt rage. He was angry that someone had shown him kindness, angry that for a moment he had believed that maybe human connection was possible, angry that the feeling of being cared for was making him feel weak and vulnerable. In his twisted thinking, kindness was weakness. Connection was danger. The only way to protect himself was to destroy the thing that was making him feel. Samuel stabbed Michael 17 times. He didn't stop when Michael was already dead. He kept stabbing, kept attacking. kept destroying the thing that had threatened his carefully constructed armor of rage and indifference. When he finally stopped, Michael's body was unrecognizable. Samuel took his wallet and left. He felt no remorse. He felt no guilt. He felt relief. He felt powerful. He felt like finally he understood who he was supposed to be. Over the next 3 decades, Samuel would commit dozens more murders. Some of his victims were chosen randomly. Some were people he knew. Some were acquaintances he cultivated relationships with specifically so that he could murder them. Some were homeless people he found on the streets. Some were sex workers. Some were vulnerable people who nobody cared about when they went missing. He developed a routine. He would stalk his victim for weeks or months. He would learn their routines, their vulnerabilities, their patterns. He would insert himself into their lives. He would create a relationship with them. And then, at the moment when they trusted him most, when they were most vulnerable, he would kill them. But here's where Samuel's story becomes particularly strange. Samuel didn't want to hide what he was doing. He desperately wanted people to know. He desperately wanted to be caught and punished. He desperately wanted to be taken seriously as the threat he knew himself to be. But he was almost comically bad at being caught. Samuel kept detailed diaries of his murders. In these diaries, he recorded every victim's name, the date of their death, the method he used, his thoughts and feelings during the crime. He wrote about why he killed them, what he felt during and after. He documented 37 murders in meticulous detail. He could have hidden these diaries anywhere. Instead, he left them in a place where they were almost guaranteed to be found. He left them in a used bookstore where he was a regular customer, writing a note inside the cover that said, "The truth about Samuel Dalton. If you're reading this, I'm the man you're looking for. I've killed many people. Please call the police." The bookstore owner found the diaries. He read a few pages and assumed it was a fictional work, a creative writing project by someone with a very dark imagination. He boxed up the diaries and put them in storage in the back of the store, thinking that Samuel would return for them. He didn't call the police. He didn't take the diaries seriously. One of the most important pieces of evidence that would eventually connect Samuel to dozens of murders was sitting in a bookstore storage room, being ignored. But this was just the first of many times that Samuel tried to confess. Several years later, Samuel went to a Catholic priest and confessed to his crimes in detail. He sat in a confessional booth and told the priest about 17 murders. The priest was horrified. He believed what Samuel was telling him. But the priest was also bound by the seal of confession, a Catholic principle that says that anything told to a priest in confession is confidential and cannot be shared with anyone, even law enforcement. The priest told Samuel that he needed to turn himself in, that he needed to face justice for his crimes. Samuel said he would. But when Samuel left the church, he didn't go to the police. Instead, he killed again. By this point, Samuel had been murdering people for over a decade, but very few of his murders had been connected. They had occurred in different jurisdictions. The victims had been reported missing, or their bodies had been found without immediately connecting them to other crimes. There was no central database, no system in place to connect murders across different police departments and different geographical areas. Serial killers thrived in this era of disconnected law enforcement. The information that could have caught Samuel much earlier was scattered across multiple police departments in multiple states. Samuel tried a different approach. He wrote a detailed letter to a major newspaper outlining his crimes, giving specifics about the murders, providing details that only the killer would know. He sent photographs of himself with the bodies of his victims. He provided names and dates and locations. In the letter, he begged the newspaper to publish his confession, to make sure that people knew what he had done, to make sure that he was stopped. The newspaper received the letter. The editor read it and thought it was either a hoax or the work of someone who was deeply mentally ill and delusional. Rather than investigating further or contacting law enforcement, the editor threw the letter away. Samuel's confession, the confession that could have led to his capture and the identification of his victims, was discarded as the rantings of someone unstable. The obsession with confession. Why was Samuel so desperate to be caught? Why did he repeatedly try to confess to crimes that he had successfully hidden? Psychologically, Samuel was experiencing what's known as confessor's guilt. Despite his lack of genuine empathy, despite his ability to murder without remorse, Samuel was troubled by the disconnect between his internal knowledge of what he had done and his external existence. He was living a lie. He knew he was a serial killer. Nobody else knew. He was walking around in society, working regular jobs, maintaining relationships, appearing normal, while inside he was screaming with the weight of his secret. In some ways, Samuel wanted to be caught so that his internal truth would match his external reality. He wanted the world to see him the way he saw himself, as a monster, as a killer, as someone fundamentally different and dangerous. He wanted to be punished. He wanted to face justice. He wanted his victims to be acknowledged and recognized. He wanted their families to know what had happened to their loved ones rather than living with years of uncertainty and mystery. But Samuel also had a narcissistic need for recognition. He wanted to be famous. He wanted his story to be known. He wanted people to understand how intelligent he was, how calculated his murders were, how superior he was in his ability to evade capture for so long. He wanted to be a legend, the most prolific serial killer in American history. He wanted to be remembered. In some twisted way, his attempts to confess were also attempts to ensure his place in the annals of criminal history. Samuel began to escalate his confessions. He would go to police stations and try to talk to detectives about his crimes. He would say things like, "I need to tell you about the people I've killed," or "I'm responsible for the disappearances in the area over the past decade," but he had no physical evidence with him. He had no specific details that would immediately verify his claims. Police would listen to him with skepticism. They would run his name through databases looking for criminal records. They would find that he had a history of psychological problems, that he had been institutionalized as a teenager for violent behavior, that he had been arrested for assault. They would decide that he was a mentally ill individual seeking attention. They would tell him to leave. They would file a report about a suspect claiming to be a serial killer. But the report would sit in a file somewhere, never connected to active investigations. Her own detective, a woman named Margaret Foster, believed Samuel. When he came into her precinct in 1998 and claimed to be responsible for at least 60 murders, something in his story rang true. Margaret was an experienced detective who had worked on several murder investigations. She recognized something in Samuel's manner, in the specificity of his claims, in the consistency of his story. She decided to investigate. She kept Samuel in the interrogation room for hours. She asked him detailed questions about his murders. And Samuel, eager to finally be taken seriously, provided incredibly detailed answers. He described victims in detail, sometimes providing information that only the killer would know. He described locations where he had hidden bodies, described methods he had used to kill. Investigation begins. Margaret Foster became obsessed with verifying Samuel's claims. She spent weeks investigating his statements. As she dug through cold case files, she contacted police departments in other states where Samuel claimed to have committed murders. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to verify his confessions. A murder in Oregon? A murder in Washington? A murder in California? A murder in Nevada. The locations and dates and methods that Samuel had described matched unsolved murders in police records. DNA evidence, when it was available, connected Samuel to multiple crime scenes. Victims that had been missing for years were finally identified. Families finally received answers about what had happened to their loved ones. But the investigation revealed something shocking. Samuel had been confessing to murders for years. He had left evidence in multiple places. He had spoken to multiple people, including priests and newspaper editors. He had tried repeatedly to turn himself in. And all of this evidence and all of these confessions had been ignored or dismissed. If anyone had taken him seriously years earlier, if anyone had bothered to investigate his claims thoroughly, dozens of lives could have been saved. The police began to compile the evidence. They interviewed people who had known Samuel, people he had worked with, people he had tried to confess to. They found the diaries in the bookstore. They found letters he had written to newspapers. They found records of him attempting to confess to police in multiple jurisdictions. They gathered victim statements from Samuel himself about how he had killed, where he had killed, and why he had killed. By the time they were done, they had documented 93 murders that they could definitively connect to Samuel. He claimed to have committed over 120 murders, but many of those additional crimes occurred in other states and could be definitively verified with the evidence available. Samuel was charged with multiple counts of murder. He was interviewed extensively by both police and by forensic psychologists. During these interviews, Samuel spoke freely and openly about his crimes. He didn't deny anything. He didn't try to minimize his responsibility. He provided details that helped families understand what had happened to their loved ones. In some cases, he provided information about where he had hidden bodies, allowing families to recover remains for proper burial. He cooperated fully with investigators. But here's the most disturbing aspect of Samuel's cooperation. He seemed to be enjoying it. He seemed to be happy finally being taken seriously as a threat, finally being acknowledged for the magnitude of what he had done. He would discuss his murders with a detached, analytical tone, as if he were discussing someone else's crimes rather than his own. He showed no remorse. He showed no empathy. He showed no concern for his victims or for their families. What he showed was pride. Pride in his ability to kill without being caught for so long. Pride in how intelligent his murders were. Pride in having achieved a kind of immortality through his notoriety. The confessions continue as the investigation progressed, and as Samuel awaited trial, something remarkable happened. Samuel didn't stop confessing, began writing letters from his jail cell. He wrote confessions to crimes he had already confessed to, providing additional details and additional context. He wrote about murders that weren't yet on the official list. He wrote about victims that hadn't been identified, providing descriptions and locations where bodies might be found. He sent letters to journalists giving them exclusive interviews about his crimes. He wanted his entire story to be known, wanted every victim to be acknowledged. He wanted complete transparency about what he had done. During jury selection for his trial, Samuel stood up in the courtroom and addressed the potential jurors directly. He confessed to his crimes in open court before his trial had even officially begun. He said, "I am a serial killer. I have murdered over 100 people. I am guilty of every charge. I deserve to be executed. I want to be executed. My victims deserve justice, and I deserve to pay the ultimate price for what I have done." The courtroom was shocked. His defense attorney tried to quiet him. The judge tried to stop him. But Samuel continued speaking until he was forcibly removed from the courtroom. His confession in open court complicated his trial. His defense team had wanted to argue various legal defenses. They wanted to challenge evidence. They wanted to argue about jurisdiction and proper procedures. But their client had just confessed to everything in front of a room full of people, including potential jurors. The trial was essentially over before it began. Samuel was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to death. He accepted the sentence. He didn't appeal. He asked the judge to expedite his execution. He wanted to be executed, wanted to face the ultimate consequences for what he had done. But even after his conviction, even after he was sentenced to death, Samuel continued to confess. He continued to provide information about unsolved murders. He continued to write letters to journalists and to law enforcement. He seemed almost compulsively driven to confess, to ensure that every aspect of his crimes was known, documented, and understood. He participated in interviews with true crime documentaries. He wrote a book about his life and his crimes, giving a detailed first-hand account of his childhood trauma and his descent into murder. He seemed to want his story to be a cautionary tale, a warning to others, a complete record of the damage that childhood trauma and mental illness can cause. The question that haunted everyone who worked on the case was simple. How many lives could have been saved if someone had just listened to him earlier? How many of his victims would still be alive if the newspaper had contacted police about his letter? How many murders could have been prevented if law enforcement had taken his confessions seriously, instead of dismissing him as a mentally ill attention seeker? The answer was devastating, potentially dozens of lives. Samuel's case raises profound questions about the nature of confession, about guilt, and about the psychology of serial killers. Most serial killers want to hide their crimes. They go to great lengths to avoid detection. They are driven by a need to preserve their secret, to maintain their dual identity as seemingly normal person and secret killer. Samuel was almost the opposite. He was driven to confess. This behavior is unusual enough that forensic psychologists have studied it extensively in trying to understand what drives someone to repeatedly attempt to confess to murders. One theory is that Samuel was experiencing what's called confessor's guilt, a psychological state where the internal knowledge of one's crimes becomes so overwhelming that the person feels compelled to confess. Even without genuine remorse or empathy, the human mind apparently struggles with the burden of maintaining a complete secret. The gap between internal knowledge and external presentation becomes psychologically intolerable. the person begins to seek ways to close that gap, to make their internal reality match their external reality, even if that means facing severe punishment. Another theory is that Samuel had a narcissistic personality disorder that manifested as a need for recognition and notoriety. He wanted to be famous. He wanted his crimes to be acknowledged and documented. He wanted to be remembered as the most prolific serial killer in American history. His confessions were driven not by genuine guilt or a desire for justice, but by a need to ensure that he would be famous, that his story would be told, that he would achieve a kind of immortality through his notoriety. A third theory is that Samuel's childhood trauma left him fundamentally damaged in his ability to maintain a sense of self. He had been told by his mother that he was evil, that he was a demon, that he was meant to hurt people. He had been abused, neglected, and victimized by every system that was supposed to protect him. His identity had been fractured and reconstructed so many times that he lost track of who he actually was. By identifying as a serial killer, by embracing the role that his mother had told him he was meant to play, he was creating a coherent identity for himself, even if that identity was monstrous and harmful. A fourth theory is that Samuel wanted to be stopped. On some level, despite his enjoyment of killing, despite his lack of empathy for his victims, Samuel recognized that what he was doing was wrong. He recognized that he was a threat to society. He wanted to be contained, wanted to be prevented from killing anymore. His confessions were a way of asking to be stopped, of asking society to intervene, even though he couldn't articulate this need directly. The truth is probably some combination of all of these factors. Samuel was a complex and deeply damaged individual whose motivations can't be reduced to a single explanation. But what's clear is that his repeated attempts to confess were not the actions of a typical serial killer. They were the actions of someone who desperately wanted their crimes to be acknowledged and documented, even if that acknowledgement came at the cost of his own life. The trial and conviction. Samuel's trial lasted 6 weeks. It was one of the longest murder trials in the state's history at that time. The prosecution presented evidence connecting him to 93 murders. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Samuel's own confessions painted a picture of a man who had systematically murdered vulnerable people over 3 decades. The victims came from all walks of life, though many were homeless people, sex workers, and other marginalized individuals whose disappearances hadn't immediately raised red flags. Some of the victims' families attended the trial and heard details about what had happened to their loved ones. Many of them wept. Many of them looked at Samuel with an intensity of hatred and grief that was almost visible in the courtroom. Samuel's defense team was in an impossible position. Their client had confessed to all the crimes. He had provided detailed evidence that connected him to the murders. He had asked to be executed. There was no viable legal defense. The defense team tried to argue that Samuel was mentally ill, that he suffered from psychosis, that he wasn't fully responsible for his actions due to his psychological condition. They presented evidence about his childhood trauma, about his psychiatric history, about the clear signs of mental illness in his behavior and his thinking. But the prosecution countered that Samuel's detailed planning and meticulous execution of his murders demonstrated clear intentionality and awareness. Samuel knew what he was doing was wrong. He did it anyway. He was culpable. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They found Samuel guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was almost ceremonial at this point. The outcome was predetermined. Samuel would receive the death penalty. The judge asked if Samuel had anything to say before sentencing. Samuel stood up and addressed the court. He spoke directly to the families of his victims. "I have caused you immeasurable pain. I have taken from you people you loved. There is nothing I can say or do that will compensate for that loss or heal that pain. I accept full responsibility for my actions. I accept that I deserve to die. I hope that my execution will provide some small measure of closure and justice for you and for your families." It was one of the few times anyone heard Samuel express something that could be interpreted as remorse. Whether it was genuine remorse or simply performance, nobody could say. Samuel was sentenced to death by lethal injection. He was sent to death row to await his execution. He would have the option to appeal his conviction, but he chose not to. He wanted the execution to proceed. He wanted to face the consequences of his crimes. He wanted to achieve finality, both for himself and for the families of his victims. Death row and the final confessions. On death row, Samuel continued to confess. He continued to provide information about crimes that hadn't yet been verified or solved. He wrote letters to law enforcement agencies in other states, providing information about unsolved murders that he believed he had committed. Some of this information proved to be accurate, some of it was false. It became increasingly difficult for investigators to distinguish between genuine confessions and false confessions, between real memories and false memories that Samuel had constructed in his mind. Over 30 years of murder, it seemed, had blurred the lines of his own memory. He could always clearly remember whether he had actually committed a particular murder or whether he had merely fantasized about it. Samuel participated in interviews with true crime journalists and documentary filmmakers. He spoke openly about his motivations, his methods, and his psychological state. He discussed his childhood trauma in detail. He talked about his mother's mental illness and abuse. He described the feeling of his first murder and how it had awakened something in him. He spoke about the progression of his murders, about how each one had become more elaborate and more calculated. He discussed his attempts to confess and his confusion about why nobody had taken him seriously. He seemed to want his entire life story to be understood and documented. In one interview, when asked why he kept trying to confess, Samuel said, "I couldn't live with the lie. I knew what I was. I knew what I had done. I couldn't pretend to be normal. Couldn't pretend to be someone I wasn't. The secret was eating me alive. I needed people to know. I needed to be recognized for what I was. I needed to stop. I needed society to stop me because I couldn't stop myself." It was perhaps the most honest and vulnerable statement he ever made, and it came from a man convicted of 93 murders, a man with no genuine empathy, a man who showed no remorse for his victims. Samuel's execution date was set for a Tuesday morning in November. In the weeks leading up to his execution, he intensified his confessions. He wrote letters to major newspapers outlining additional crimes, participated in final interviews with journalists. He seemed almost eager to reach the end, to finally face the consequences that he had been seeking for so long. Legacy and unanswered questions. Samuel Dalton was executed on November 14, 2009. He died calmly, quietly, without any last words spoken. By all accounts, he seemed relieved to finally be meeting his end. In the weeks and months following his execution, law enforcement agencies continued to investigate the additional crimes he had claimed to have committed. Some of his final confessions proved to be accurate. Bodies were found in locations he had specified. Additional victims were identified. But some of his confessions remained unverified. Some of the crimes he claimed to have committed couldn't be definitively connected to him. The confusion between real and false confessions meant that there were likely unsolved murders out there. Murders that Samuel had actually committed but that couldn't be verified with the available evidence. Samuel's case raised important questions about how law enforcement investigates serial crimes, about the importance of believing confessions even when they come from people with psychiatric histories, and about the failure of systems that are supposed to protect society. Multiple police departments, multiple prison systems, multiple mental health professionals had all encountered Samuel at various points. Every single one of them had failed to take his confession seriously until it was far too late. The case of Samuel Dalton also raised questions about the nature of guilt and confession. He had confessed repeatedly, openly, and honestly about his crimes. Yet he had shown no genuine remorse, no genuine empathy, no genuine concern for his victims. He had confessed for reasons that were primarily narcissistic and self-serving. This challenges our assumptions about what confession means. We often believe that confession is an indicator of remorse, that someone who admits to wrongdoing is seeking redemption or forgiveness. But Samuel's case shows that confession can be divorced from remorse. Someone can confess completely and honestly about terrible crimes while remaining fundamentally unchanged, fundamentally unrepentant, fundamentally incapable of empathy or guilt. Samuel's confessions did provide one important service. They allowed families to finally know what had happened to their loved ones. Years of uncertainty were replaced with horrifying certainty, but certainty nonetheless. Families were able to recover bodies and provide proper burials. They were able to grieve with closure rather than with endless wondering. In that limited sense, Samuel's compulsive confessions provided a kind of justice, though it was a cold and incomplete justice that couldn't restore what had been lost. The systemic failures. The case of Samuel Dalton is a profound indictment of the systems that failed to stop him. The newspaper editor who received his confession and discarded it. The priest who was bound by the seal of confession and couldn't report his crimes to authorities. The police officers in multiple jurisdictions who didn't take his confession seriously because he had a history of psychiatric problems. The bookstore owner who found his diaries and assumed they were fiction. Every single one of these people had the opportunity to intervene, to investigate, to take him seriously. Every single one of them failed, but the failure wasn't primarily individual, it was systemic. The era in which Samuel committed most of his murders was the 1980s and 1990s. Before the emergence of sophisticated databases that could link murders across different jurisdictions, before DNA technology became routinely available in police investigations, before video conferencing allowed real-time communication between different police departments, before the internet allowed information to be shared instantaneously across vast distances, Samuel thrived in this era of disconnected law enforcement. He operated in multiple states, in multiple jurisdictions, with no central system connecting the murders back to him. Additionally, there was an inherent bias in how police interpreted Samuel's confessions. He was a man with a history of psychiatric problems. He had been institutionalized, had been arrested for assault. Police made assumptions about him based on these factors. They assumed that his confessions were either false confessions or the fantasies of a mentally ill individual. They didn't take him seriously because he didn't fit the profile of what they expected a serial killer to be. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong, and dozens of people died as a result. There was also a cultural bias regarding who mattered as a victim. Many of Samuel's victims were homeless people, sex workers, and other marginalized individuals. Their disappearances weren't immediately investigated with the same vigor as the disappearances of wealthy or prominent people. It's easier for a serial killer to operate when their victims are people that society doesn't care much about. People whose disappearances don't make headlines, people who are already living on the margins of society. This bias in how police resources are allocated and how seriously different victims are taken allowed Samuel to continue killing for far longer than would have been possible if his victims had been people from more privileged backgrounds. Finally, there was an institutional bias within law enforcement toward dismissing confessions from people with mental health issues. Police are trained to be skeptical of confessions, to use interrogation techniques to verify whether someone actually committed a crime. But this skepticism, while sometimes useful in preventing false convictions, also meant that genuine confessions were sometimes dismissed as unreliable. Samuel's case shows the danger of this bias. Sometimes people do confess to crimes they actually committed. Sometimes people with mental health issues are telling the truth. Dismissing all confessions from people with psychiatric histories meant that genuine confessions were being ignored. Final thoughts and lessons: the story of Samuel Dalton, the killer who couldn't stop confessing, is a cautionary tale about multiple systemic failures. It's a story about how individual failures to take confessions seriously can lead to massive loss of life. It's a story about how stigma regarding mental illness can blind us to truth. It's a story about how the marginalization of certain victims means that their murders are uninvestigated with adequate resources. It's a story about how serial killers can thrive in systems that are undesigned to catch them. But it's also a story about the psychology of confession. Samuel couldn't stop confessing because the weight of his secret, despite his lack of genuine empathy or remorse, had become psychologically intolerable. He had been shaped by childhood trauma into a person incapable of genuine human connection, but he was still human enough that carrying his secret destroyed something inside him. His compulsive confessions were his way of trying to close the gap between who he was internally and who he appeared to be externally. They were his way of trying to be recognized for what he was. They were his way of trying to be stopped. They were his way of trying to achieve a kind of twisted redemption through the acknowledgement of his crimes. Samuel's victims didn't receive redemption. They received death. Their families received decades of uncertainty, followed by horrifying certainty, followed by grief and trauma. Samuel's execution didn't bring them justice. It was merely a consequence, a necessary removal of a threat. But the damage was already done. 93 people were dead. 93 families were destroyed.
And
this tragedy could have been prevented if someone, just one person, had taken Samuel's confession seriously. If you or someone you know is struggling with violent thoughts or with thoughts of harming others, please reach out for help. Mental illness is not an excuse for violence, but it is a reason to seek treatment. If you're struggling with depression, suicidal ideation, or thoughts of harming others, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 9-8-8. If you're experiencing a mental health crisis, go to your nearest emergency room or call emergency services. Getting help is not weakness, it's strength. It's the responsible thing to do. The story of Samuel Dalton teaches us that confessions matter, that we need to take them seriously, even when they come from unexpected sources, and that our systems need to be designed in a way that allows for genuine verification and investigation rather than automatic dismissal based on preconceived biases. It teaches us that mental illness is real, and that people struggling with mental illness deserve to be taken seriously. It teaches us that the marginalization of certain victims leads to their murders not being investigated with adequate resources. And it teaches us that the weight of carrying secrets, even for someone fundamentally broken like Samuel, can eventually become so overwhelming that confession becomes compulsive and inevitable. Thank you for watching. I encourage you to think about these systemic failures and to consider what can be done to prevent them in the future. I encourage you to take confession seriously. I encourage you to ensure that all victims receive equal attention and resources regardless of their social or economic status. And I encourage you to break the stigma around mental illness by recognizing that people struggling with mental health issues are people too, and they deserve to be treated with dignity and to have their words taken seriously.